hope the dragon breath does not interfere with the autofocus. Hello, and welcome once again to Frankly, Why Am I Here? Why are you here? Today, I have to tell you, I have regrettably been reading again. I've been reading this. Liberalism is a sin. Why have I been reading this? You might well ask. If it was you who recommended this book to me, then thank you, for it is indeed a masterpiece. I read it because I thought it would be helpful to see what the church had said before the magnificent Pascendi came out some years later. I've talked to you a little bit about the teachings of Pope Leo XIII in the Catholic social teachings, but during his papacy, this excellent book came out, written by a priest from Barcelona. This is noteworthy for several reasons. In this video, I will explain why Father Sardà said that liberalism is a sin, what he defined liberalism as, and how it differs from modernism, which would be condemned in the majestic encyclical Pascendi Dominici Gregis of Pope St. Pius X, which came some years later. Once I have got beyond why liberalism is a sin, I will move on to this. This is called a Catechism on Modernism. This book was written by another priest called Father Lemius. What he did was he tried to explain Pascendi to an audience through the use of question and answer. He employed the words of Pope St. Pius X in a book that was easy to read. It is thanks to the work of Tan Books, the heroic work of Thomas A. Nelson, who founded Tan Books, that we have these books to read at all in such a cheap and accessible format. The late Thomas Nelson died this summer, but his work lives on. It is magnificent to be able to read these masterpieces, and today I hope to explain to you why it is so important to read books from the Catholic tradition from the before times. Liberalism is a sin. Seems like a bold claim. The book has a banger title, and Father Sardà y Salvany delivers within it. His book is no mere one-line wonder. Walter, if you would be so kind as to stir yourself from the digitally induced torpor that you Zoomers consider to be your idiom, and display a picture of the Don. Don Félix Sardà, as he was also sometimes known, was not only a Don, but he looked like one. Just from the look of him, you can tell that he could probably easily deadlift 4 plate. What a boss. And his book is a luminous masterpiece. In it, he said things like this. It must be said that liberalism in the idea is the absolute error, and in facts, the absolute disorder. As a consequence, in both cases, it is a grave sin, a mortal sin. The Don's excellent book is a demonstration of how the traditional writings of the Catholic Church combine practical wisdom, a subtle understanding of philosophy, and spiritual salvation in easy-to-read volumes. What the Don did is simply outstanding. It is readable, it is profound, and it is a practical guide to the madness we inhabit today. You might recall that Pascendi, its title, means feeding. It means feeding the flock, actually. That was the subtitle given by Pope St. Pius X to Pascendi Dominici Gregis. And in order to understand why he had to feed the flock, you must understand how we have been starved. Don Felix's book, Liberalism Is a Sin, explains how the idea of liberalism resulted in the deliberate subtraction of God, his natural order, and the meaning and moral structure of our entire lives. Don Felix's book, Liberalism Is a Sin, appeared in 1886. It caused a bit of a stir, not least within the ranks of the Church. Just as Pope St. Pius X Pascendi after it warned, the liberals and modernists of which these two volumes warn exist within the church herself, and did so at the time. Don Félix, you might be interested to learn, was a cancelled priest. Or at least, that was the idea. His own bishop in Barcelona decided to write a counterblast to Liberalism Is a Sin. He employed a priest to write a book that was a defence of liberalism and an attack not only on the ideas that Don Félix put in Liberalism Is a Sin, but also upon himself. This resulted in both books being sent to the Vatican. And what happens next is going to delight and amuse you all. Unfortunately for the liberal Bishop of Barcelona, who hoped to see the Don cancelled, the Pope at the time was a Catholic. It was Pope Leo XIII. Perhaps not the best Pope to approach with a rebuttal of the idea of liberalism as a sin and a defence of that diabolical ideology. The Vatican responded with a letter from the Sacred Congregation of the Index. It commended the Don for his magnificent defence of the Catholic faith, his identification of the errors of liberalism, and at the same time, the liberal bishop and his priest came in for a bit of a telling off. In fact, the Sacred Congregation requested that their book be withdrawn completely from circulation. Maximum lol, handing a total and flawless victory to our champion, the Don. Walter, if I could once again hope to stir you from your digitally induced stupor, could you please show the picture of the Don once more, but this time with the deal with it gif, showing the glasses descending upon the face of the Don. What a boss was the Don. In order for you to understand why I recommend this book to you, and I do, I'm going to read out some little extracts. One of them will explain why the Don wrote this book at all. He said, "Liberalism is the root of heresy, the tree of evil in whose branches all the harpies of infidelity find ample shelter. It is today the evil of all evils." This isn't just an evil that sought to supplant Christ from the church, and it does. It's also one that the Don identifies as generating the moral collapse of our contemporary world. He said, "The theatre, literature, public and private morals are all saturated with obscenity and impurity. The result is inevitable. A corrupt generation necessarily begets a revolutionary generation. Liberalism is the program of naturalism. Free thought begets free morals or immorality." And here we come to the central point about liberalism. How did the Don define it? And why is it different from modernism? The Don defined liberalism as the idea that man should replace God with his own reason. If you like, liberalism is the cult of reason. Man would rationalise his life, rationalise God away by use of his conscience and preference, and of course, do the same with government, its institutions, and eventually morality. The Don correctly pointed out that if you begin to think like this, you inevitably arrive at the conclusion that all religions are equally good. Now, the Don also added that that means inevitably that none of them are in fact any good at all. This is the pathway from what you might call ecumenicalism, inspired by liberalism, to see all religions as having equal merit. And of course it ends up with them having none. This of course is the reason why the doctrine of universal equality in politics and society was condemned around the same time by Pope Leo XIII, because it universally degrades everything. The Don wrote this in 1886. Almost 80 years later, in the Second Vatican Council, Dignitatis Humanae was published, which said that there should be no coercion towards religion and that there should be freedom of religion. In just under 8 decades, from being a damnable heresy, the Vatican had changed, and it then produced a document which effectively endorsed the freedom of religion. The Don points out that this freedom, of course, is a rebellion against God, and of course against the church founded by Christ, the Catholic Church, in case you were wondering. Given the confusing times that we find ourselves in, I think that's a distinction worth emphasising. How is this different then from the modernism that would be condemned over 20 years later in Pascendi by Pope St. Pius X? Although Pope St. Pius X said that modernism was the synthesis of all heresies, the difference here is that one begets the other. The liberal idea is older than modernism. The liberal idea is that man does away with God by means of his reason. The modern idea is that man can do away with reason as well. By which strange and involuted path we end up with postmodernism, where we can do away with any ideas about basic reality, morality, or the existence of facts. Liberalism was the idea that rationalism could be supreme. And the Don talks a lot about the dangers of rational supremacy. Again, freedom of thought, freedom of belief, freedom of the self. This is a life without restraints, a life, as it were, without limits. But as the Don also expertly points out, this does not in fact emancipate mankind, but liberates him into a void. There is no further meaning in this void. There is no purpose to life. The condition of man is absurd. And to show how much philosophical subtlety he packs into this brief book, he also points out that whilst liberalism maintained that reason was supreme, it also said that only its reasons were any good. This is a paradox, of course. Liberalism is a doctrine that preaches the liberty of thought and of reason. But if you attempt to question the limits of the liberal idea, this is condemned. Of course it is, because liberalism produces liberal chauvinists, people who believe that they are better than you and that everything they believe is better than your beliefs because they believe it. If you want a further discussion of this and to see how prescient the Don was, you could have a look into Patrick Deneen's Why Liberalism Failed, and there's a chapter in there on the paradox of liberalism that goes on about this. Basically, it's a self-contradictory idea. It's a very good indication also of why it is good to read Catholic books from the before times. That is to say, before modernism took hold of the Vatican. It will also explain how it did so, because the Don's book, as well as Pascendi, both warn about the presence of liberals and modernists in the church itself, and that is why it was seen as such a danger. The Don said liberalism was nothing less than warfare upon the church. The Don also explained how the liberal idea, the idea of the supremacy of reason and personal conscience, naturally begets Protestantism. But of course, he shows how this leads to atheism, because once you start to decide for yourself what you are going to do, and not God, then naturally this leads you into practically any system of beliefs. And by this strange route, we come to our contemporary condition, where we see the fruition of the liberal and modernist ideas. Today, you can understand the modern world in terms of its liberal political beliefs as a sort of pagan cult. Liberalism begins with a supremacy of man's reason. Don't tell me how to live my life, say the rationalists. The modernists come along in the late 19th century And they start to question the liberals. And they say, well, what's all this about reason? I'm not particularly reasonable myself. There's no reason to do this and no reason to do that. Instead of looking outward towards the extension of rational principles through government and institutions and society as the liberals dreamed, making, if you like, a utopia of reason, the modernists looked within themselves to their fantasies, their feelings, their everyday lives and their daily experiences, and gradually they began to project outwards from what they'd seen within into the world. And today you can see the combination of the liberal agenda with a sort of modernist paganism. The things that are held up in place of the worship of Christ are things like the climate cult, the rainbow flag, open borders, and of course mass migration. Many of these things are simply recent accretions to the idea that we should look inside ourselves and then project outwards onto some totem our sense of significance and our purpose in life. And this is why this political religion, if you like, takes on a fervent and fanatical tenor in its adherence. The Don explains how we get from reason to chaos. He shows how the liberal idea, from its inception as the supremacy of reason, leads us to total moral collapse and the asylum that we inhabit today. I did start off this recent series with an idea of going straight into Pascendi because it is a masterpiece. Like the Don's book, like the Catholic social teaching, Pascendi should be read by everyone, not just Catholics or people who believe in Christ. But it should be read by everyone because it is a luminous combination of philosophical insight and practical wisdom towards the salvation of souls. It speaks of man's higher spiritual purpose, which is of course to follow Christ and to get to heaven so you can be with him, rather than dissipate yourself in a kaleidoscopic array of self-destructive passions. This is the void into which liberalism eventually liberates mankind. Having watched Bishop Williamson's excellent series on Pascendi, in which he goes on about things like Immanuel Kant, and, if you like, the history of the Enlightenment from its inception to the birth of liberalism, I understood that in order to explain why something like Pascendi was necessary, you had to explain where the ideas had come from that had so corrupted even members of the church, and of course our society. How could it be that there was a project so ambitious that its aim was effectively to replace our entire civilization with itself? This is the reason why I've gone into these diversions, to explain how we have come to live life among the barbarians. I also hope to explain the difference between culture and civilization. Culture, of course, is whatever is done at the time, and it can be manufactured as well as, if you like, arising from the tribal customs of a people. Our mass culture, I would argue, and I have, is intentionally manufactured to make belief in the liberal system. In such a time of subtraction, confusion, distraction, and misdirection, it's important to remember where the roots of our civilization are. As Eliot pointed out in his late poem Burnt Norton, the Archimedean point of the human race is the appearance of Christ on earth. Everything before him and after him only makes sense in reference to that point. If you remove him and you replace him with reason, and then the political beliefs inspired by that godlessness, then you end up with nothing. If you read these books like Liberalism Is a Sin, like Eliot's Four Quartets, like the Catholic social teaching and the Pascendi of Pope St. Pius X, you will not only enrich your life and strengthen your faith, but you will realise the sheer staggering scale of what has been subtracted from the experience of mankind by the liberal project. Thanks to Walter's endless ingenium and innovation, I am now going to attempt to listen to some of these voice messages, what I have been sent.
If we are truly in a state of war, as you suggest, then the strength of the surveillance regime is fiat currency. Our current financial system is a weapon that can be mobilized to silence political defiance. Canadian trucker protesters have seen their bank accounts frozen by the little Castro tyrant Trudeau. Party leaders such as Nigel Farage in the UK have been debanked for their political beliefs. Australian journalists such as Julian Assange, who have exposed war crimes, have had donations blocked. Even Ukrainian citizens unwilling to be drafted into war have seen their bank accounts frozen. Economics is the bedrock of warfare. This is why during World War II, the Ministry of Economic Warfare was established, and the Special Operations Executive, SOE, headed by Major Sir Colin McVean Gubbins, whom I will add garnish an excellent colonial mustache that rivals yours, to engage in guerrilla operations to destabilize economic activity in enemy territory. If it is true that you cannot serve God and money, why then are we so contented to use the devil's debt notes when admonished in the scriptures to light and just weights and scales? I would love to hear your thoughts on possible solutions such as gold, silver, and possibly Monero. Yours truly, Sean Bradford.
Well, Sean, that was really quite the tour de force. And I do appreciate your appreciation of my modest little smasher. Yes, our system is usurious. And yes, the basis of what we've come to know as liberal democracy was practically a cabal of international financiers who are also responsible for the creation of the Federal Reserve. I can't really speak to that, but I would direct you to the interviews that I've done on Substack with Mr. Richard Cook, who was a federal analyst for decades and has written very intelligently on the creation of fractional reserve banking and the subsequent enslavement of the United States and was its liberal Western empire. I also have interviewed a fellow called David Hunt, who is an excellent scholar of usury, and his book Something for Nothing is a brilliant treatment of that subject, which should interest Catholics and economists alike. Again, this is not my subject, but I do know that the economic system is evil, and I would also agree with you that the economic system is prior to the political pantomime that we are presented as democracy nowadays. I think that the liberal project generally is simply an international empire in imagination which sought to collapse all the nations into some kind of global supermarket, a borderless utopia populated by mutually hostile strangers, all seeking a bargain on credit. So yes, I think it is profoundly evil. The remedies are possible. They will be painful. And it is part of my own personal mission to see to it that some of them are carried out. But I'm afraid I'll have to go into that in another episode. Thank you for your remarkable contribution, Sean, and I'm sorry that I couldn't give you a more comprehensive answer.
Frank, this is Franco. I love the show. It's very, very funny, very informative. But listen, my friend, it's very difficult to stay sane through these difficult times. In Canada, the future is very grim, and our local diocese is run by those charismaniacs who hate tradition and they mock us online and in person. What can we do to survive the tumult of our age? Thank you very much.
Well, hello, Franco. And I do like saying that name, Franco. No reason at all. That's just a mysterious mystery that can never be solved. What can you do? Well, you can, of course, primarily refuse to go insane along with your tormentors. I would also hold fast to the traditional Catholic faith, not only because its practice and its sacraments will, of course, redeem you, and that the pursuit of grace is the highest purpose of mankind. However, it's also important to read books as these to restore your sanity when you are saturated by messages from your lunatic enemies. These are, of course, diabolically inspired, and they are there to demoralise you and to demoralise our existence entirely, to the point where it replaces the value of life with price. And of course, in Canada, if you ever get depressed about the situation, they'll recommend that you kill yourself as a form of healthcare. I understand how miserable it is. I understand how optimistic or even reckless it might be to say this. But it is my confirmed belief that the liberal system as we knew it has practically no future. The governments in Britain, in France and in Germany are effectively paralysed. The outlier in Canada will suffer the same fate. There is no international network with the financial and military backing to rival that of the United States, which has now been effectively unilaterally withdrawn from the liberal global imperial model, meaning its demise is in sight. Hold fast to the Lord and do not despair. The time horizon is approaching for the liberal project generally, and I dare say tomorrow belongs to us. Lol. There has been some additional feedback. I do try to get onto the internets and to reply to your comments underneath these videos, and I'm grateful for all of them, to be honest, because even the ones that aren't generous and kind, or indeed appreciative about my work, have value to me. To be honest, I probably wouldn't do this if people like you did not tell me that it had been useful and informative to you, because I despise the concept of internet personality. As you can see, I'm not exactly cut out to be some kind of viral sensation. However, some bloke in the comments suggested that I was a prideful LARPer, because he presumed that I dressed up as if to pretend I came from the 19th century. He was referring to my modern linen pinstripe suit, which was made cheaply by a company recently, not in the 19th century. This one that I've got on today was made shortly before I was born by scummers in the north of England like myself, for scummers like myself. It is a Yorkshire tweed suit from the 1960s. Why am I wearing it? As you might be able to see, it is cold enough for me to show dragon breath, as I say to the kids in the shed, and so out with the winter tweeds. Do I look like this normally? Yes, I do. Other people look like this in the country, in England. It might be surprising for you to learn that there are still English people in England, but nevertheless, some of us do go about like this. And I think it invidious to suggest that I'm somehow prideful for not going about got up as if I have simply escaped from a jumble sale wearing children's shoes. As you can see, I perform leisure activities, but I do not wear loungewear whilst I am doing so. In fact, I deadlift in a pair of corduroy trousers attached to a pair of old army braces. Why do I do this? That is my daily go-to attire. I can't wear them here because apparently they make me invisible to the autofocus. After the First World War, quite a considerable part of Germany was actually broken up into 4 Soviets in preparation for Germany becoming communist. So, blame Walter for my suit, and in fact for my presence here and everything else. Because one thing I've noticed is he never gets any stick for anything, and if you ask me, he deserves it. Next time, I hope to finally get on to discussing Pascendi Dominici Gregis. I hope to have given you some idea why Pope St. Pius X titled his encyclical in 1907, Feeding the Flock, because what came before was a project of the mass starvation of meaning and purpose of mankind that has produced the chaos of the liberal system we can see dissolving around us today. Goodbye for now, and God bless you all.
The most repeated phrase in Scripture is "do not be afraid." We are called to speak the truth, to proclaim the gospel, and to live our lives without fear. For the past 3 years, we've brought this mission to the very heart of the church. At the Rome Life Forum, you won't just hear truth proclaimed, you'll have the chance to ask your questions directly to the speakers. This is your opportunity to engage, to challenge, and to go deeper into the battles we face today. Fear not. Her immaculate heart will triumph.